APES. This is Chapter 6, Population and Community Ecology. So we'll look at populations, how they change, and how that might be affected by the community and the interactions in the community by those abiotic and biotic factors. So to start off, we look at how those populations fit into our ecosystem structure. We start with the individual. Those individuals make up the population of one species. All of the species together in a given area is a community, and the species, including the biotic and abiotic factors and the environment within, is the ecosystem, and all of the ecosystems on Earth create our biosphere. So some of the ways that we measure population and the factors that regulate population, including abundance and distribution, we have to factor in population size, obviously, which is the total number of individuals in an area. Next is population density. It's the number of those individuals within a specific area. So, as an example, Japan has a relatively high population density, one of the highest in the world, as opposed to Russia, where the people are spread out over space, and so their density is actually relatively low. Population distribution, as we talk about the population in Russia, they're distributed over a large area, is how those individuals are connected or distributed over space with respect to each other. And we'll look at some of the examples of that later. There's population sex ratio, so we like to look at the ratio of males to females. And then our population age structure, which takes into account the age of individuals in certain categories. We usually like to reserve that just for studying human populations, as it's kind of difficult to determine sometimes in nature the age of certain animals in a population or even certain plants. So here are those examples of distribution. There's three types: random, uniform, and clumped. Random distribution is often associated with plants. They don't generally have control over where they grow, besides the nutrients that are in the soil and other environmental factors. Their reproduction usually happens through seeds, which are distributed randomly in different locations, and they grow generally where they fall. So plants, definitely a good example for that situation. Again, a perfect situation here is with birds in uniform distribution. Their nests require a certain size or a certain amount of space. So there's also very limited quality space for them to choose from. So they want prime real estate, but they know that that their nests require a certain amount of space. So they tend to be uniformly distributed, using as much of that prime real estate as they possibly can. For clumped distribution, these are usually for animals that live together as a community, and they're using the resources in a particular area. So one space is good for their community because of the resources that are there and the interactions between the biotic and abiotic factors in the environment. So that group, that clump, tend to be in that space, distributed away from maybe others that are located in other places that also have the resources that they're looking for. So here are some other factors that might limit or determine a population's size. So we've talked about density-dependent and density-independent factors. Here are these definitions. So in density-dependent, again, the size of the population is going to affect an individual's chance of survival. In density-independent factors, has nothing to do with the size of the population. Like Bozeman said, it's really by chance. There are environmental effects or climate effects or weather events that occur that have an effect on the individual's survival rate. So looking at these density-dependent factors and some examples, one would be competition. So as space becomes a limiting resource, competition between species for resources is going to increase. Some animals are sharing the exact same food, the exact same space, and maybe even the same mates. And so competition for those things is definitely going to increase as density increases. Just like with resources, resources are going to decrease as the population increases. So in thinking about these factors that affect population, these density-dependent factors, how might these examples relate to the rate of evolution in that population? Something to think about. So how do we measure growth? So we use two different models to show the growth of a population. Growth rate is the number of offspring an individual can produce in a given time period. Okay. Intrinsic growth rate is the number of individuals that can, or the number of individuals that can reproduce, or the number of offspring an individual can reproduce under ideal conditions. If resources were not an issue, how much would that population be able to grow? That's what we're taking into consideration with intrinsic growth rate. So to show this model here for exponential growth, or as you may refer to it as the J-shaped curve, this is all populations will go through this kind of growth. It just increases continuously over time. So in an intrinsic situation, this graph would just continue growing exponentially with no limitation whatsoever. And many times when we look at populations that are doing this, it seems like it is limitless, this growth, especially the human population. But that's not realistic. And so we have to consider some of the factors that might limit that exponential growth, and at what point is that going to happen in a population. And that's where we take into account logistic growth. In logistic growth, that population increase is exponential initially, but then slows because of a carrying capacity. And that carrying capacity is the amount of individuals that can exist together in a population based on the amount of resources the environment can provide for them. So as it reaches that carrying capacity, the population rate, or the rate of population growth, tends to level off. This is what we call this S-shaped curve, which can be used interchangeably. So this logistic growth model is not always perfect. The population will generally overshoot the carrying capacity, and then when resources become extremely limited, that population will see some die-off, maybe some increase, and will continue to die off as this graph is showing. So what are the different types of reproductive strategies that can factor into population, how it grows, and what limits it? So we have two different types of reproductive strategies here. There's K-selected and R-selected. In K-selected, the population of a species that grows slowly until it reaches that carrying capacity. So it's a slow process. And this is the case because of how often K-selected species reproduce and how long they tend to live. With our selected species, the population grows really, really quickly, but also has a lot of individuals that die early, and will often overshoot, as in the previous model here, will overshoot that carrying capacity and then die off. So here are some traits, differences, and similarities between K-selected and R-selected. So with K-selected species, they tend to live really long. The age that they tend to mature, is later in life. The number of reproductive events happens very infrequently. So the number of offspring that they actually have are less. And the size of the offspring tend to be larger. So smaller animals are not necessarily going to be considered K-selected species. In K-selected, I like to say K is for caring. Parents care about their children. They take care of them over time and develop the kinds of survival strategies that they're going to need to live that long lifespan. So because of all of this, because there's few reproductive events, they have less offspring, the population growth rate tends to be pretty slow. So all of that into consideration, our selected species tends to be the exact opposite. They have short lifespans, they have many, many offspring, partially because that offspring doesn't survive. Quite a few of them are killed early in life, and they don't have that long lifespan. So reproduction needs to happen frequently. We need to have more and more animal or more and more offspring in order to keep that population going. So here's taking those concepts into consideration and plotting them as far as their lifespan and their survivorship. Type 1 tends to be that K-selected species. They have offspring that tend to live and survive well into their reproductive years and later on in life. With type 2 species, there's die-offs throughout the population, throughout population age. Okay, so there's about equal number of animals that are dying off at each age group. In type 3, the survivorship is actually very low. They're reproducing like crazy, but not all of those offspring are surviving. And so there's a large drop-off in survivorship early in life and continues later on in their lifespan. So here's a concept in interactions and how this might affect populations and why populations are affected the way that they are. This concept is metapopulations. So we talked about geographic isolation in Chapter 5 with evolution, and this is taking that into consideration. So there are metapopulations that exist in geographic isolation that will sometimes connect with each other from movements of individuals between them. So it keeps that population or that genetic diversity going within that population. And you can see here there's a mountain lion who works as an individual that can move freely back and forth between different mountain lions or different populations, spreading their genes throughout. So what I'd like you to do, taking all of this into consideration, try to answer some of these questions. What are the two factors that influence population size? I'd like you to provide examples for each. What are the factors that control carrying capacity? as well as what is an example, what would be an example of an R-selected species. Hope to go over these answers in class with you guys after you view this video. Good luck, and I'll see you next class.